Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to week number 6 for PPA 500. Make sure we are all set here. Okay, we are good. I'm sure that folks will be joining us along the way, but I want to be respectful of your time. It is just after 4 o'clock, so I thought we would just go ahead and get going and allow your colleagues to join us in a few minutes, hopefully. We are in week 6, so I know this course is, at least for me, this course is speeding along very quickly to its conclusion. It's hard for me to believe we're already in week number 6, but the course officially ends in 2 weeks from tonight. And so we really are very much at the tail end of the course and the closing weeks of the course. So what I thought I would do is, first off, let me thank you for your assignments. I went through and looked at Canvas essay number 3 and provided feedback on that along with a grade. And again, I thought everyone did a nice job on their essays. I thought they were insightful. I thought they addressed the prompt very well. Saw some commonalities and some differences in terms of the way in which the essays were approached, which is always good. A lot of the themes that I saw hearken to the Graham Allison article, which is what you're supposed to use as your basis. And so I thought the essays overall were very well done. I have also reviewed all the midterm assessments that have come in and have returned those to you with some comments. The way in which I handled the comments is in the feedback box. I have just some very general comments for you, but then within the exam itself, I use the annotation feature. And so I just inserted comments as annotations. And so when you see those little blue circles in your exam, if you click on those or hover over them, then you'll be able to see my comments. And so I went through and I graded each of the scenarios separately. Each scenario was worth 20 points. Obviously, each of the questions worth 10 points. And if you missed any points or if I took any points off, there should be some type of justification for it in those annotations. But I thought everyone did really well. The grades were all clustered in the A and the B range, which is certainly excellent for the midterm. So there were no major concerns, no major worries. I think everyone did a nice job of applying the information in those scenarios. So I hate to do this to you because you just finished up your midterm and got your grade back on your midterm, but because we only have 2 weeks left, and I promised you I would make the assessments available at least 2 weeks ahead of time, it's time to make the final assessment available to you. So I have made the final assessment available on our Canvas site. I did that a couple of days ago, but I thought, just like with the midterm, I thought it would be a good practice for us to spend some time going through the final assessment. I'll walk you through the 5 scenarios and the questions related to each scenario, just so everyone is very familiar with what we're doing on the final, and then entertain any questions you might have. But the format of the final is exactly the same as the format of the midterm. So the same approach to take. I think everyone did a really nice job on the midterm being parsimonious with their answers, answering the questions and applying the information appropriately without going overboard in terms of writing a dissertation or writing a book. And so I thought parsimony was very well demonstrated on the midterm. So take that same approach you use to answer the questions on the midterm and use the exact same approach to answer the questions on the final assessment. Now, as you'll see, the final assessment is not cumulative. The final assessment just picks up from the end of our midterm and takes us through the end of our class together. That's essentially 2 weeks, which this class works out. So you don't have to reach back for any of that information we've covered in previous weeks. So let's go through each one of these scenarios, and then, like I said, I can entertain any questions you may have, but at least get us all on the same page in terms of what we're doing with the final assessment. So in scenario number 1, your friend applied for a job with the FBI 8 months ago. She is obviously frustrated with the delay in the hiring process. And that's something a lot of people talked about in their Canvas essays. A major difference between public and private organizations is the protracted, much more complicated, much more rule-bound hiring process in the public sector. Bills need to be paid, so she finally decided to accept a job with a private sector company. She laments to you how she wishes she could have waited for the FBI job, but doesn't understand how the federal government hires new employees. And I use this scenario with the FBI for a reason. There are a couple of reasons. One reason is we have had several people move on from the program, graduate from the program, and secure positions in the FBI. So if we are going to have someone placed in the federal level, typically the agency they tend to get placed in is the FBI. We've had several students go there. And the FBI has an even more complicated hiring process than a lot of other government agencies, because there are background checks and there are a lot of different hoops that you have to jump through to get a job, especially if you are applying to go into the training to be a special agent. But your friend here has not gotten a response from the FBI for her application, so she's gone off and taken a job with a private sector corporation. 1A, as a good student of public administration, you decide to provide her with some background information on the eras of public employment in the United States. Describe the three main eras of public federal employment and how these eras have changed over the years. This is information that we will cover in class next week, and some of the information we will start our class with next week. I'll take you through the different eras of public employment, especially at the federal level, the era of gentlemen, the era of spoils, and the era of merit. We'll talk about what distinguishes those eras from each other and how we evolved in the way in which we hire people to work in the career civil service. So I have all the information for 1A after next week. 1B, after regaling your friend with the history of federal employment, you begin to reflect on current hiring practices. Which era or eras are best represented by today's federal employment and why? So that's your question 1 on eras of federal employment, which we will get to next week. Then in scenario number 2, the Department of Aging, which is our friend from the midterm assessment, now has a new leader. Mr. Lemon is gone, and the new governor has selected you as the head of the department. You walk into an organization that has neglected human resource management functions for years. One of your first meetings is with your human resources director to discuss how to modernize human resource functions. Positions have not been reviewed for several years, and most employers are working outside of their position descriptions. So in 2A, what would you instruct your human resources director to do? In other words, what functions of human resource management need to be completed? We will discuss the functions of human resource management next week. Another major issue faced by the organization is its relationships with its bargaining units. The current contract has expired, and the union and department are now at an impasse. Discuss the strategies that could be used to resolve this impasse. Again, this is information we will cover in class next week. I'll present you 3 main categories of impasse resolution. We'll talk about fact-finding, we'll talk about mediation, and we'll talk about arbitration, how they work, the advantages and disadvantages of each, and that's the information you'll then be using to answer question 2B. Scenario 3, the city of Preble Heights, another throwback from our midterm assessment, is struggling with its budget. It uses a simple line item budget and typically increases expenditures each year in connection with increases in GDP, gross domestic product rates. That's a very common approach that some governments will use. It's called deterministic modeling, and it's a way in which they will forecast their expenditures and the revenue for the next year based upon one indicator, and that indicator is sometimes the GDP, the gross domestic product. Over the past 5 years, the city failed to complete its budget on time, and it struggled to balance revenues and expenditures. The city auditor found that many programs are inefficient and are not achieving their goals and objectives. Standard & Poor's and Moody's, and those are 2 of the primary credit rating agencies that will issue credit ratings for cities when they go out there to issue debt and to borrow money. Both of these credit rating agencies have reduced the city's credit rating due to its budget issues. As a city council member, you and your colleagues need to recommend a new budgeting format to try and alleviate these concerns. 3A, select and recommend a new budget format for the city that will address the concerns in the scenario. Next week, one of the final things that we'll talk about will be the 4 main types of budget formats. And I'll introduce you to line item budgeting, performance-based budgeting, program-based budgeting, and zero-based budgeting. We'll talk about their advantages and disadvantages and where they work best as opposed to situations where they don't work quite as well. So you'll get all that information on those budget formats next week. So be selecting one of those 4 and then advocating its use here for the city of Preble Heights. 3B, the city's aquatic center needs renovation. Given the city's fiscal problems, it is clear that the city lacks the resources to complete the project without borrowing money. The Aquatic Center is open to citizens for lap swimming Monday through Saturday from 2 p.m. to 7 p.m. Citizens pay a $3 fee to use the facility, and 100 residents use the facility for lap swimming 200 days out of the year. The city also charges a $20,000 per year fee to the school district and club teams to use the facility for practices. A total of 6 teams pay this fee. So it's a $120,000 fee per year that they're collecting from the school district and from these club teams. Since the city, the operating expenses for the Aquatic Center amount to $180,000 a year. So the grand total that they're spending per year is $180,000. Since the city does not have the money to pay for renovations, it proposes a bond to cover the cost. Which type of bond would you recommend and why? As we talk about the management of fiscal resources next week, we will not only talk about different budget formats and different sources of revenue, but we will also then talk about different forms of what we call bonds. And bonds are long-term borrowing mechanisms. So whenever a city needs to borrow money over a 10 or 20 or 30 or 40-year period of time, it typically issues a bond. And so we'll talk about different types of bonds and their advantages and their disadvantages, which will give you the information you need then for answering 3B. Then in scenario number 4, we're going to continue here with our good friends in Preble Heights. The city of Preble Heights also has a unit known as the Economic Revitalization Department, or the ERD. ERD's primary task is to implement a policy known as the Urban Revitalization Initiative. The initiative provides cash grants to businesses who renovate their facilities and remain in urban areas as opposed to moving to other states. The primary beneficiaries of these grants are obviously business owners who are willing to stay where they are and continue to contribute to economic growth in urban areas of the city. And the urban areas of the city are primarily in the downtown area. To be successful, the policy would need to provide enough grant money to offset the cost savings of potentially moving to other states and areas. Not all members of ERD are in favor of the policy goals and believe that it's not the role of government to influence business decisions. These employees have sometimes been accused of slow-walking grant applications to delay the payment of money to applicants. From a policy implementation perspective, utilize Pressman and Moldovsky's implementation research to illustrate some of the barriers to successfully implementing this policy. This is information that we will talk about tonight. Then I'll introduce you to Pressman and Moldovsky's research and some of the obstacles and the barriers that they highlight that make policy implementation difficult. Then in 4B, drawing upon the 4 models of organizational effectiveness, examine this scenario from the perspective of these models. How would each model define the agency's effectiveness in implementing this policy? We will also talk tonight at the end of our time together about the 4 different models of effectiveness. I'll introduce you to a goal attainment model, a systems resource model, a participant satisfaction model, and an internal process model, ways in which we can define and measure effectiveness, because at the end of the day, that's what we are trying to do in the public sector. With all of our reforms that we have tried to implement over the past several decades, they have all been geared toward trying to make government more efficient and more effective. And so we'll introduce you to these different ways in which governments can measure effectiveness. So you'll be selecting, you'll be talking about those 4 models and how each model for defining effectiveness, how would each model to define the agency's effectiveness in implementing the policy. So again, this is information you will get from class tonight. Then scenario number 5 is kind of our program evaluation type of scenario. It has now been 2 years since Preble Heights renovated its recreation center. The Parks and Recreation Commissioner, Julia Lopez, approached the council last year with a proposal to address juvenile delinquency in the city. The city has seen a rise in the incidence of graffiti and vandalism over the past several years. Ms. Lopez proposed creating a program of after-school sports offered free of charge at the recreation center. The after-school sports program is offered from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Friday and 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. on Saturdays. The goal of the program is to give youth something to do after school and deter them from engaging in acts of graffiti and vandalism. This program has been up and running for 1 year. You are a program specialist and the city manager has approached you to create a program evaluation to evaluate the effectiveness of the after-school sports program. 5A, identify and discuss the primary independent variable, dependent variable, and control variables that you would use in your program evaluation. And 5B, identify and discuss the research design or the evaluation design that you would recommend using to evaluate the effectiveness of this program. Again, this is program evaluation information, and this is the information that you will also get in class tonight. So tonight on our agenda, we're going to talk about public policy analysis and the policy process and the role public administrators play in the policy process. We're going to talk about the role public administrators play in the evaluation of public programs. And we'll talk about how we measure effectiveness in those four main models of measuring effectiveness. That will all be discussed in class tonight. So essentially, the information that you need in order to answer scenarios 4 and 5, you will get in class tonight. The information you need to answer scenarios 1 through 3, you will get in class next week. So once we are done with our class next week, we will have covered all the information that we need to cover for you to perform well and be successful on this final assessment. But again, the format's exactly the same. The final assessment is due no later than 11:59 and 59 seconds p.m. on March 15th, which is our official last day of this course. Any questions, preliminary questions at all on the final assessment? If you, as you go through the final assessment, you look at it, if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, send me an email. I'm happy to clarify any questions that you may have. But again, it's the exact same format that we use in completing the midterm assessment. And again, I apologize that we have to talk about the final right away after you just finish up the midterm, but it's kind of the nature of the beast when you get into a hybrid course like this that only lasts 8 weeks. Assignments roll around very, very quickly. Okay, let me switch out our share here. And let me share out the slides we'll start with tonight. There we go. So let's just kind of recap where we are, where we've been, where we are, and where we are going. So last week, we spent a lot of our time talking about these theoretical perspectives in the study of public administration. And most of those theoretical perspectives, because public administration studies public bureaucracies, which are public organizations, most of these theories centered on how to make our organizations more effective and more efficient. So basically last week, when we talked about theoretical perspectives, we not only introduced you to the idea of these different types of theories and how these theories evolve, but we also talked about essentially what managers do, what public leaders and managers do in terms of trying to make their organizations efficient and effective. And let me just break real quick. I see in text chat, Wendy has a really good question. Are we meeting on the 15th? That is an excellent question. As of right now, I am planning on allowing you to have that 15th and not at the 15th to finish up your final assessment. So the way in which I'm visualizing that evening on the 15th is that I will be available and you can contact me, you can send me an email, but rather than having you sit here in class for a couple of hours on the 15th, I thought I would have you just work on your final assessment. Even in a hybrid class like this, the university requires that we provide time for a culminating final assignment. And so that's what we'll do on the 15th. So if that's provided we get through all of our information this week and next week, which I think we will, but as long as we get through all the information we need to, then I don't think we'll need to have a live synchronous session on the 15th. So it's a great question, Wendy. But right now, no, we will not have to meet on the 15th. So last week, we talked about essentially what managers and leaders do in terms of managing their organizations, because that's where they spend a lot of their time, is trying to make their organizations more efficient and more effective. This week, we're going to look at some of the functions of public leaders and managers in terms of what public leaders and managers do in the public policy process. What are some of their roles that they play in policy formulation, policy implementation, and policy evaluation? We'll then also tonight talk about the role of public leaders and managers in evaluating public programs as well. And then next week is when we'll talk about the role of public leaders and managers in how they manage their human resources and how they manage their fiscal resources. So for the rest of the class tonight and next week, we're focusing on those functions of public administration and some of the actual things that public administrators do as they work in the public sector. So that's how we're going to kind of wrap up our class together. So for tonight, when we start talking about public policy, one thing I really do need to emphasize is this distinction between public policy and public programs. And so when you think about public policies, you think about public programs, they are certainly related, but there are some differences between the two. When we think about a public policy, we want to think about it as kind of an overarching umbrella. And so, for instance, we may have a public policy that deals with housing. And our public policy goal may be, in our housing policy, our goal would be to house unhoused citizens. And so we have people living on our streets that need to have affordable and adequate housing. So the goal of our housing policy is to house as many of those unhoused citizens as we possibly can. That's our overarching policy goal. How we actually achieve that goal and the specific programs that we put in place, those are our public programs. And so in order to house unhoused residents, we may have a variety of different public programs that we will be implementing that will deliver services to these residents to help them find affordable and adequate housing. So for instance, we may have a public program that is geared toward renovating hotel space, unused hotel space, and transforming that unused hotel space into affordable living space for people who do not have adequate housing. That's one public program that contributes to the overall goal of eventually housing all of our unhoused residents. Another public program could be perhaps a portable voucher program, whereby we provide vouchers to these citizens in order to help them afford the purchase of affordable and adequate housing. So those would be two public programs that are meant to support the overarching policy goal of housing unhoused residents. So one way to think about it, I used to live in Southwest Florida. And in Southwest Florida, we had bridges everywhere. There are bridges to go from where I lived in Fort Myers over to Cape Coral and to go to Sanibel Island. And there was this mammoth bridge that went from Southwest Florida, from Naples, across the Gulf of Mexico to get you down to the Florida Keys. If you've ever gone to the Florida Keys, you know that you got to drive across this long bridge. Well, we can think about the relationship between policies and programs as a bridge. And so the policy is kind of the bridge itself. It's the overarching bridge that gets us to our goals, but then the stanchions that hold up that bridge are our public programs. So the public programs are the specific things that we are doing to then support our overarching policy goals. So that's a way to think about some of the differences between a public policy and a specific public program. But to start off tonight, we're going to talk about those overarching public policies, and I'll take you through the different phases of the policy process and then how public administrators are involved in those different phases of the policy process. This information also then obviously will prepare you for your PPA 670 policy analysis course. Last week, our discussion of organization theory prepared you for PPA 660 organization theory. Our discussion tonight of policy will prepare you for 670 policy analysis. Our discussion later on this evening about program evaluation will then prepare you for PPA 696. Some of the information you're going to get tomorrow, next week, in terms of managing human resources, will prepare you for your PPA 577 course. And then at the end of class next week, when we talk about managing fiscal resources, that information will prepare you for PPA 555 public budgeting and finance. And so one of the goals of this class is to prepare you to then move forward in the program for all these other core courses that you'll be taking as part of the curriculum. So let's start with policy. So different people teach policy differently, but whenever I teach the policy class, I usually break up our coverage into three main phases of the policymaking process. The first phase is policy formulation. And we've talked before about policy formulation in this class when we were talking about the differences between public and private sectors. We said one of the main differences between the public and the private sector is that whereas the private sector is traditionally only involved in policy implementation and execution, it's the public sector that's also involved in policy formulation. And there is a role for administrators to play in the policy formulation process. And formulation is literally the designing of these public policies. So, another way to think about it is when we talked about Woodrow Wilson, the politics administration dichotomy. We said that politics administration dichotomy is no longer a strict delineation between politics and administration, because administrators get involved in the political world, and they get involved in the political world through the formulation of public policies. So it goes beyond just implementing these policies. We are also involved in the formulation of these policies as well. Formulation of public policies is really predicated on this idea of agenda setting. And we talked about agenda setting back when we talked about power and Gaventa's definitions of power. And remember that discussion of John Gaventa, we said Gaventa identifies three different faces of power. There's the visible face of power, the hidden face of power, and the invisible face of power. In the visible face of power, that's the over face of power. And then the hidden face of power is what he called mobilization of bias. That's that agenda setting. That's that reason why there were never any mine safety legislation that was being passed out of the state legislature in Tennessee and Kentucky, because the coal mine owners were able to manipulate the agenda to keep those issues off the agenda of the state legislatures. So agenda setting is the ability to put issues on the formal decision-making agenda of a decision-making body, or conversely, being able to keep issues off of that agenda. Legislative bodies will only pass laws and only formulate policies about issues that are on their formal decision-making agenda. And so in order to have a policy to address a problem, that problem must first make it onto the agenda of that formal decision-making body. And a very famous public administration, public policy scholar known as John Kingdon, he wrote a very famous book, Agendas, Alternatives, and Public Policy. He argued to us the process by which issues get onto a formal decision-making agenda. He says we have a clear definition of a problem. We have some proposals, some solutions to that problem. Politically, it becomes imperative that we address that problem. And that's what opens up what he calls the policy window and gets that issue onto the formal decision-making agenda. And that's how we have resulting public policies formulated according to John Kingdon. Now, when we are formulating these policies, deciding what gets on the agenda, and then once it gets on the agenda, deciding how to deal with all these issues and problems on the agenda, we at the very heart are doing decision-making. We are making decisions about not just what problems we're going to solve through our public policies, but how we are going to solve those problems and how we are going to design our public policies to solve those problems. So in order to understand how decision-making is done in the policy formulation process, we need to understand the different models or the different approaches of decision-making. So the four different models of decision-making that we will cover in this class are rational comprehensive decision-making, incrementalism, mixed scanning, and garbage can model of decision-making. So four different ways in which we can make decisions in the policy formulation process. So let's start with the rational comprehensive model of decision-making. This rational comprehensive model is sometimes referred to as the root approach, because we get to the root of the problem in terms of making the decisions. When we are being rational, I think we're all pretty familiar with what we mean when we say we're going to deal with this in a rational way. It means that we're going to kind of remove emotion and we're going to base our decisions on empirical evidence. So we're going to collect all the possible empirical evidence out there, analyze that empirical evidence, and then make an informed, rational decision. So in doing rational comprehensive decision-making, we go through several distinct steps. One step is to clearly identify the goals, clearly identify what we are trying to achieve. So what problem are we trying to solve and how are we trying to solve that problem? So we identify our goals and we agree upon what those clearly defined goals are. Once we have clearly identified and agreed upon our goals, Then we collect all the available information, all the information, possible information that is out there, and then use that information, analyze that information to identify a range of alternatives. So we'll identify alternative solutions to solving this problem and achieving our goals. And that range of alternative solutions that we create will be a full range of alternatives. We will think of all solutions that can possibly apply to this problem and solve this problem to help us achieve our policy goal. From that full range of alternative solutions, we will then select the best alternative solution. We will then implement that best alternative solution, and that best alternative solution then becomes the heart of that public policy that we have formulated. So it's a very comprehensive approach. We're taking into account all the information that's out there, assimilating all that information, analyzing all that information, and using that empirical information to come up with the best solution to this problem. And that best solution then is our public policy. Now, the obvious advantages of that is that it is comprehensive. And if you're coming up with the best solution, that will give you the best possibility and the best probability of achieving your goals and solving your problems. The problem with rational comprehensive, you kind of have a twofold problem with it. One problem is in terms of what we call externalities. Anybody familiar with what an externality is? What's the definition of an externality? If I remember that from a microeconomics course, what an externality is? Externalities are oftentimes considered to be consequences, and they're unintended consequences of an action. So there can be positive unintended consequences, and there can be negative unintended consequences. So you think about a childhood immunization program, and the childhood immunization program is designed to provide immunizations to children from low-income households. Those people, those children from those low-income households, they're the ones who are going to benefit directly from that program. But by lowering rates of infection across the entire society, the entire community will essentially benefit from that program. That's a positive consequence, a positive externality. I'm sorry, Luciano, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, thanks. I was going to comment that they're positive and negatives. I have a question, though. The word ramifications is used also in policy as well. Will that be more like is the example of having a negative externality? Would that be the same meaning, or am I wrong?
Yeah, usually you're right. Yeah, usually when we use the word ramification in policy, we're usually referring to something more negative, a more negative externality, a more negative consequence. So there's usually a negative association sometimes with the use of ramifications. And so, yeah, ramifications oftentimes seem very similar to being a negative type of externality. So, and we do have some of our policies do create negative externalities. Some of our actions create negative externalities. The classic example of a negative externality is obviously pollution. So, as the economists would tell us, we have a widget factory. Economists love to talk about widgets. And so we have a widget factory that is in the business to create widgets. And they do a very good job of creating a very high quality widget product. The problem is, in the course of producing that widget product, they are polluting the river, the stream that runs behind the hill that the factory is on. They didn't intend to create that negative consequence. They didn't intend to pollute the river, but it's a negative unintended consequence, a negative externality that then has impacts on the society. And so we can have negative consequences, we can have positive consequences. And sometimes when we're doing our rational comprehensive decision making, when we are making the decision, we do not know what some of those consequences will be until that decision is already implemented. So we don't know some of those positive and negative externalities of this policy until we've actually implemented that policy and evaluated the impacts of that policy. So sometimes it's not possible for us to be completely rational at the very beginning of coming up with these decisions. We don't know what those consequences may be. And then another criticism of rational comprehensive approach that is much in line with what we just talked about is what's called bounded rationality. And there's a famous public administration scholar by the name of Herb Simon. And Simon, I won't say Simon says because that's too corny, but Simon tells us that as human beings, we have this thing known as bounded rationality. There are cognitive limitations to our cognitive ability. So even if you want to say we're going to go out there and collect all the information possible, we don't have the cognitive ability to identify all the information and assimilate and analyze all that information. We just don't have that ability as human beings. We are too limited in terms of our cognitive abilities. So it's doubtful we're ever going to be completely rational comprehensive in the way we make decisions in the policy formulation stage of the process. We do at times see glimmers of rationality where we are more rational than we are at other times. And that is certainly possible, those glimmers of rationality, but we're never really truly completely rational. And so there are alternative decision-making models that are more in line with our bounded rationality and our cognitive limitations. A second decision-making model that we oftentimes use is incrementalism. And you're probably very familiar with incrementalism because that's the way we make a lot of our decisions in the public sector. In incrementalism, we realize that goals are not easily defined or agreed upon. Sometimes it's difficult for us to know what our goals are or to come to an agreement on what those goals are that we are trying to achieve. Sometimes it's difficult for us to come to an agreement on the problem and the nature of the problem that we are trying to address with this public policy. Since we cannot come to an agreement on the clear definition of our problems, of our goals, we also have the problem with our bounded rationality that we are not going to be able to collect all the information that's available out there. Information, especially today, is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It surrounds us. And it's difficult for us to be able to have the time or the resources or the ability to collect all the information necessary. So instead, what we will do is we will collect as much information as we possibly can within our time constraints and within our cognitive limitations. Since we are not collecting all the possible information, we're not able to put together a full range of solutions. So instead, we put together a limited range of alternative solutions. Then we compare those alternative solutions to each other in a process known as limited successive comparisons. So we'll look at solution A and compare it to solution B. We'll then compare solution B to solution C, solution C to solution D. Then we'll go back and compare A to D, and then B to D, and so on and so on. We make these limited successive comparisons among the solutions that we have been able to generate within our limitations. Since we have not put together a full range of alternatives, we cannot say with confidence that we are selecting the best alternative. The best alternative may be something we never thought of, and that best alternative is still out there, and we've never even developed that alternative solution. So instead, what we do is we select, based upon our limited successive comparisons, the first alternative that is appropriate that works in that situation. And so A is better than B and C, so we're going to select A. Doesn't mean A is the best, but it's the one that at this point in time, in this situation, is better than solutions B and solution C. And then we implement that appropriate alternative solution as the basis of our public policy. This is an approach that was discussed at length in a very famous article by Charles Lindblom. And Lindblom gained great acclaim with his article in which he talked about using incrementalism to make decisions as opposed to being rational comprehensive. This incrementalism approach he referred to as the branch approach. So whereas the rational approach is the root approach, you get to the root of the tree, in incrementalism, we're never able to get to the root of the tree, the root of the problem. So instead, we make marginal changes and we're trimming around the branches. Trimming around the branches, doing those marginal changes, that is the incremental approach. In the world of budgeting, most of our budgets are constructed with incremental decision-making. We look at what we spent last year, and then we add a small increment increase in spending for the next year, and that's how we create next year's budget. So Lindblom, even though he got a lot of acclaim for his article, said that all he was doing was describing how decisions are actually made in the public sector. He didn't see it as being anything earth-shaking, any groundbreaking discovery. He said, I'm just explaining how we make decisions in the public sector. And so I think we do see a lot of incrementalism because of our limited time, our limited resources, and our limited cognitive abilities. Obviously, it's a quicker way of making decisions. It's a less intensive way of making decisions. But the problem with incrementalism is that if you just continue doing year after year the same thing, if those policies are not achieving their goals, then you're never going to achieve your goals. If you're just increasing the spending a little bit each year after each year, you're not fundamentally going back and readdressing why you're not achieving your policy goals. And so we're not going to make huge, big mistakes with incrementalism, but we are continuing to repeat the same mistakes over and over and over with each new manifestation of our public policies. But I think incrementalism is certainly a much more realistic way to look at how we make decisions in the public sector and in the policy formulation process. But when you look at rational, comprehensive, and incrementalism, you are looking at decision-making models that are on the opposite ends of the spectrum. Way over here, you have rational, comprehensive, and way over here, you have incrementalism. So there must be something in between. There must be some happy middle ground between the two extremes. And that happy middle ground is mixed scanning. In mixed scanning, our third decision-making model comes from Amitai Etzioni, which is a great name. I like to say it, Amitai Etzioni. And Etzioni says in mixed scanning, we're going to combine rationality and incrementalism. We're going to be rational for our big issues, and we're going to be incremental for our small issues. It makes sense. You know, if you're going to be building a city hall that's going to cost you $70 million and is going to last for hopefully 70, 80, 100 years, you hope that you will put a lot of thought, collect a lot of information, and be as rational as you can possibly be. And we typically do that with our capital improvement projects. We put together a capital improvement plan. We'll then go out there and do a needs analysis. We'll put together our facilities master plan. We'll put together a specifications plan for each of the buildings that we are going to construct. We are very, very specific and put a lot of time and effort into putting these plans together for a big project such as that. You know, the school district that I used to be on the board with back in 2000 and gosh, I think it was 14 or 15, maybe it was 14, we passed a big bond measure, a $148 million bond measure. And the bond proceeds were to be used for the reconstruction, the modernization of our 15 school campuses. Well, before we could actually do that, before we could actually decide how we were going to spend that money, the $148 million is a lot of money to spend. So we put together a needs analysis, looked around our district at the needs of each one of our school facilities. We then put together a facilities master plan to plan out all the different construction projects at all 15 of our schools. We then put together what were called education specification documents. And that's something that's required whenever you fund a new school facility. You put together a specification document for each one of those new facilities. Those specification documents would then specify exactly what would be put into that school, what that school would look like, whether that school would have a science lab or a flex lab or a computer lab, or all those specific elements, construction elements for each one of those buildings. We use what we call cluster committees, where we had different clusters in our jurisdiction that were made up of people who worked in the district, made up of community members, made up of parents and elected officials. And we had all these different cluster committees that worked on putting together these specification documents for each one of our schools, just to kind of show you the type of time and effort and thought that goes into a big capital project like that. That's much more along the lines of rational, comprehensive decision-making. A smaller type of issue, such as how many staples you're going to buy for an office next year, that can be done much more in an incremental way, because it's a much smaller issue and the ramifications of making a mistake are not nearly as big in scope as the ramifications of making a mistake in building a new $50 million school. And now schools typically now, because of cost escalation, run anywhere from about $50 to $60 million for a typical elementary school. High schools are going to get you well over $100 million in costs. So the advantage of mixed scanning is that it kind of makes intuitive sense to us. Big issues are rational, small issues are incremental. Are there any problems with mixed scanning, using rationality for big issues and incrementalism for small issues? Do you see any problems with that?
How do you determine, I mean, sometimes how do you determine what a big issue is and what a small issue is?
Absolutely. Yep, that's perfect. How do you know what's a big and what's a small issue? There's a lot of subjectivity that is involved. Now, obviously, we're spending $148 million on capital improvement projects. I think everyone can kind of agree that that's a big issue. But that's kind of the extreme. But on these other issues, what is big and what is small could depend upon the person. For one person, it's a big issue. For another person, that same issue is a relatively small and minor issue. So you're exactly right. There's a lot of subjectivity that is built into the determination of what is a big issue versus what is a small issue. But at least with mixed scanning, what Amitai Etzioni is doing is he's giving us an alternative so we don't have to be either or. So you don't have to be on one end of the spectrum with rationality or the other end of the spectrum with incrementalism. But our fourth decision-making model, and one that I am a fan of, and you may have run into this before, is garbage can model decision-making. And I like the garbage can model decision-making a lot, not because of its title. I hate the title. I think the title is not a great title, and it kind of leads us to believe, well, we make decisions by, you throw everything in a garbage can, you shake it up, and what comes out is your decision. That's not how it works. So I don't really like the term garbage can model decision-making, but I think it's pretty apropos for a lot of the policies decisions we make in policy formulation. Garbage can model decision-making is somewhat similar to John Kingdon in his agenda setting model that we talked about on that second slide tonight. In garbage can model decision-making, we make policy decisions, especially major changes to our policies or the creation, the formulation of new policies at the confluence of four different streams of thought. So where these four different streams flow together, kind of like you have four rivers that flow together, that confluence of those streams, that's where the decisions are made. And it's kind of like what used to be Three Rivers Stadium in Pittsburgh. And it's called Three Rivers because you have three rivers that all flow together at just south of that stadium. That's the confluence. So those four different streams that need to flow together in order to make these big changes to public policy are the participant stream, the problem stream, the solution stream, and what the authors call the choice opportunity stream, which is what John Kingdon would call a triggering event that creates a policy window in which we can make big changes to our policies. So let's deal with each of these streams. So your first stream is the participant stream. The participant stream says that you have the quote unquote right participants in place. You have people in decision-making positions who are predisposed to developing a new policy solution or are predisposed to making major changes to the current approach we have taken to try and solve an existing policy problem. So you've got the people in place who are ready to make a change. Your problem stream, you have all these problems that are floating around out there in societal consciousness. This is what John Kingdon calls the primordial soup of problems. There are problems out there just kind of floating around. People are aware of those problems, but they haven't really given a whole lot of thought to distilling them into clearly identified problems that can be solved. But once you start getting problems that start to be, you start to get kind of this coalescence of opinion around this is the problem and this is the nature of the problem, that problem is essentially then ripe to be solved. So you've got a problem that kind of has been clearly defined, that people have started to agree, yes, this is a problem, and this is why it is a problem. In your solution stream, you have all these possible solutions that are out there that can be used to solve that problem. These solutions, though, may be pre-existing solutions. They may be solutions that have been generated decades ago for a different type of problem, but these solutions that were generated decades ago can be taken and applied to this modern present-day problem. I like to think of this as kind of being like the Quentin Tarantino model of decision-making, in that if you're a fan of Quentin Tarantino movies, you know that they're oftentimes not sequential. And from a chronological perspective, they kind of bounce around all over the place. Well, this is kind of like Quentin Tarantino in that solutions may predate the problems that you're applying those solutions to. That's much different than rationality and incrementalism. In rationality and incrementalism, we identified the problem and then we generated a unique solution to address that problem. So problems always predated solutions. Here in garbage can model, solutions may actually predate those problems. And so we can reach back and grab a solution from a previous generation and apply that solution to resolve a modern day problem. And then the fourth is what we call choice opportunities. That something happens, some type of triggering event happens that galvanizes public opinion around the idea that we need to make a change to the way in which we are addressing and trying to solve this problem. So let me give you a couple of examples of garbage can model decision-making. One example of a triggering event, obviously one of the biggest examples of a triggering event that we've had in the past several decades was 9/11. And so 9/11 occurs, and 9/11 serves as a triggering event for a whole-scale change to the way in which we address Homeland Security policy. It led to the creation of a Department of Homeland Security, the creation of the TSA, the creation of all these regulations that we have to adhere to in flying on airlines. The creation of led to the creation of the Real ID Act, and so that's something that California has been struggling to try and keep up with. I think we've just gotten an extension through, I think 2025 or 2026 on coming into compliance with the Real ID Act. But again, that was all part of these policy changes that came in the wake of 9/11. That was clearly a triggering event that caused a major change to Homeland Security policy. Let me give you another example of garbage can model decision-making. We can kind of follow through the entire process. So we had an airline disaster, and that airline disaster happened in 1996. And that was the crash of ValueJet 582 into the Florida Everglades. ValueJet 582 crashed in the Florida Everglades, killing 110 people, all 100, well, not all people on board, but 110 people on board. The problem was that there had been a fire that had broken out in the cargo bay of the plane. And by the time the crew realized that that fire was raging, it was too late to do anything to save the plane. By the time they realized that the fire had already burned through a lot of the electronics on the plane, and the plane was unrecoverable and unfortunately crashed into the Florida Everglades. Well, what you had there is you had participants who were like consumer rights groups, airline safety groups, and certain members of Congress who were ready to make a major change to our policy in terms of airline safety. The problem in terms of airline safety was a pretty clear one. We had this situation where we were not able to detect fires in the cargo bay of these planes until it was too late. The solution was a pretty simple solution, requiring the placement of smoke detectors in the cargo bay of planes so that it will alert the crew before the fire gets out of hand. We didn't invent smoke detectors in 1996. Smoke detectors have been around for many, many years. We took a pre-existing solution and applied it to this problem. And the triggering event obviously was the 582 airliner crash. All four of those streams all flowed together and created this new policy that requires the placement of smoke detectors in the cargo bay of planes to solve this problem of not being able to detect fires in cargo bay of planes until those fires were already out of control. So it's just kind of a brief example of how the garbage can model decision-making can be used in making policies. And I think that the garbage can model decision-making, at least parts of it, are true for most of our policy formulation processes for most of our policies. So those are four different ways in which we can formulate policies. And there is certainly a role for public administrators to play in the initial formulation of those policies. You can think about from the problem definition perspective. A lot of these problems that occur are seen by agencies. They're seen by administrators within agencies. They're the first ones to see the problem. And so they actually are able to define the problem for elected officials. They're also involved in the creation of solutions, that as elected officials are struggling to find solutions to the problems, they're going to reach out to the experts. Public administrators who have been implementing policies and programs in this policy area for years, they're the ones who have the expertise. They're the ones who have the experience that they can then bring to bear on the development of potential solutions that can then become part of our policies. And so there is certainly a role for public administrators to play. in the process of formulating these policies and making big changes to the policies that we already have in place. Once policies are formulated, obviously they have to be implemented. And even the best designed policies can fail and not achieve their goals if they are not properly implemented. Now, in your basic civics type of perspective with public administration, we normally think, well, elected officials make the policies and then administrators are charged with implementing and executing those policies. We know there is not that true politics administration dichotomy. We know that we're not only involved in implementation of policies, but we're also involved in that formulation. But in terms of implementing the policies, once we actually have to put those policies in place, there's a very famous piece of research by Pressman and Waldowski, and I would argue it's probably the most famous piece of research in the entire history of policy implementation research. And what Pressman and Waldowski did is they looked at the implementation of a singular federal policy in Oakland, California. And what they wanted to know is they wanted to know, why was this policy so difficult to implement? Why was it failing in Oakland, California when it was being implemented in the 1970s? What were some of the barriers? What were some of the obstacles to proper and effective implementation of the policy? What they found is that there were a lot of barriers. And just to note some of the barriers that they found in their research, one barrier to effective implementation, the existence of multiple goals. So when you have multiple policy goals that you are trying to achieve with one given policy, those multiple policy goals can oftentimes run counter to each other and can conflict with each other. So the more goals you have to try and achieve, the more likely it is that you will have conflict between those different goals. The more decisions that policy implementers have to make in the implementation process, the less successful that implementation tends to be. So if you write a very vague piece of legislation, a very vague policy, and just hand it over to implementers, the more decisions they have to make about the specifics of implementing it, the more likely it is that implementation is going to go haywire, and that's going to go in all kinds of different directions, and it's not going to be implemented properly. The intensity on the part of implementers, how strongly do they believe in this policy and achieving these policy goals? This is kind of a commonsensical one. The more your implementers believe in the policy and the goals of the policy, the more likely they are to work hard to implement that policy effectively and correctly. The amount of bargaining involved. If there's a lot of bargaining that has to happen to make implementation possible, the more bargaining there is, the more likely there is a chance for successful implementation, because you end up having all these implementers bargaining with each other over the essentials of the policy. All that bargaining means there's very little doing. And if you're bargaining all the time, it means you're don't have a whole lot of time left to actually implement the policy. And the creation of new agencies. Oftentimes, especially this is something that the national government does, so the national government promulgates this policy and then has state and local governments implement it, they will oftentimes create new agencies to facilitate that implementation. By creating those new agencies, you are creating an additional level of bureaucracy. And by creating that additional level of bureaucracy, sometimes you can actually end up slowing down that implementation process. But of all of those barriers to proper implementation, the one that Pressman and Waldowski really focused on was the direction and intensity of the feelings of participants about that policy, how strongly they support that policy, how much they oppose that policy. And their direction of preference, as well as their intensity of that direction, will have a big impact upon the successful or unsuccessful implementation of policies. So you can see in the chart on the screen, it's a really simple kind of 2x2 table. So in your top left-hand cell, you have a situation whereby you have implementers who believe in the policy, they're very positive about it, and they're strongly positive about it. They are really true believers in this policy and their policy goals. If they are very positive and strongly positive about the policy, that's the best case situation for implementation. In those types of situations, you have very little delay in implementation. Implementation is done relatively quickly and efficiently, and you have no bargaining. It just gets implemented the way in which it's supposed to be implemented. So that's your best prospect for proper implementation. If you have implementers who are still positive, they still believe in the policy, but they're not that intense in terms of their belief in the policy, you may end up with some minor delays, but you're still not going to have a whole lot of bargaining. You're probably still going to have a good prospect of getting that policy implemented effectively. The worst situation, obviously, is at the bottom of that chart, where you have implementers that are negative toward that policy. They do not support that policy. On the right-hand side, the bottom right-hand cell, those are going to be implementers who don't agree with the policy, but they're not really going to fight the policy that hard. You're going to have moderate delays. You're going to have some bargaining over the peripherals, bargaining over the margins of the policy. It'll slow down the implementation of the policy, but there's still a good chance that policy will probably still be implemented, just not in the way and just not in the time frame that you would have hoped. The worst case situation, obviously, is the bottom left-hand cell. People feel very strongly against the policy. They're very negative about the policy and the policy goals. That's where you have maximum delay. That's where you have people trying to bargain over every aspect of the policy. They're bargaining over the essential aspects of the policy. It's very unlikely in those situations that that policy is going to be properly implemented. This is a theme that is also echoed by another public administration theorist called Martha Durthik. And Martha Durthik believes that in order to get people to strongly support our policies in the implementation period, we need to include those implementers in formulation. We need to include the implementers in the formulation of the policy because that then gives them buy-in in the policy. And the more they're involved in formulation, the more likely it is that they will then support the eventual implementation of that policy. So there are good aspects of including administrators in policy formulation because it then facilitates what they do in policy implementation. But by including administrators in policy formulation, as we talked about in the previous class, some of the consequences of that is it makes more technical policies because you've got these expert administrators who are throwing in their 2 cents in formulation. So it will lead to more technical aspects and more specifics in those policies. And it also gives more control to the executive because these administrators work in the executive branch. If they're involved in the formulation of the policy, that's going to in turn, by extension, give the chief executive more of a role in that policy formulation process as well. So we formulate policies, we're involved in the implementation of those policies, and then we have to evaluate those policies. And the policy evaluation process is done to see if we are achieving our policy goals or how well, what progress we're making toward the achievement of our policy goals. The purpose of evaluation is hopefully both formative as well as summative. In a summative approach to evaluation, we are coming up with the conclusion to how effective this policy is, how well this policy achieved its goals, how well did this housing policy achieve the goal of moving people into affordable and adequate housing. Then we also have formative evaluations. And with formative evaluations, we are feeding information back into the process. So we're feeding information back into the policy formulation and the policy implementation phases in order to improve both the design of the policy as well as how that policy is being implemented. If you're doing evaluation for a formative reason, it's vital you have that feedback loop. So you can feed back all the evaluation information you got back into formulation as well as back into policy implementation. One of the problems with evaluating policies is we tend to evaluate policies too soon. We don't give policies enough time in order to achieve their goals. And if we evaluate them too soon, we're going to come to the summative conclusion that this policy is not working, it's not achieving its goals. Well, maybe it will someday, it's just we haven't given it enough time in order to achieve those goals. If our goal is to move unhoused residents into affordable and adequate housing, that's not going to happen overnight. That's going to be a gradual process that may take years before we can achieve that goal. If we go and we evaluate that policy after 2 weeks, obviously it's not ready to be evaluated. So one of the things we do in evaluation is we conduct these things called evaluability assessments. And literally with the evaluability assessment, we are evaluating if the policy is ready to be evaluated. So we have to ask our questions, are these long-term goals? And if so, Are there some operative, some middle range goals that we can measure along the way that we've had time to accomplish? Because if we're going to measure the long-term goal and we haven't had time to accomplish that long-term goal, we don't need to evaluate that policy at this point in time. So that's one of the problems is we're just trying to evaluate a lot of our policies too soon, and then we declare them to be failures. Audits are a major part of the policy evaluation process. And again, this is a place for public administrators to be involved in terms of the review of these audits. A couple major types of audits we tend to use in evaluation: financial and management-based audits. In a financial or legal-based audit, we ask the question, how is the money being spent on this policy? How are we spending the money? What are we spending the money on? Are we spending the money on the legally appropriate ways of spending that money? The management or performance-based audit, we ask the question, how well are we spending the money? So did spending the money on this policy, did this help us achieve our policy goals? So we have to take this information we get from our audits and from our evaluation process and feed that information back through the policy process in terms of a formative type of manner in order to improve both the design as well as the implementation of those policies. In public administration, we would hope that the future of our policies will be determined by the information that's developed in the evaluation process, and that we will determine how to change our policies and how to change implementation of those policies based upon that empirical evidence that we have collected in evaluation. We know that's not always true. We know that policies are oftentimes impacted by politics. And so even if a policy is not achieving its goals, if it is a policy that is supported politically by the party in power, those policies tend to hang around for a long time and get additional funding, even if they are not effectively achieving their policy goals. So we have to always remember that there is this political side to policy formulation, implementation, as well as evaluation. But being involved in the policy process is certainly a primary role that a lot of public administrators play currently in modern day public administration. But again, this is just kind of a really brief overview, very much the tip of the iceberg in policy to kind of get you ready then for your policy analysis course. When you take policy analysis, you will then get into some of the specific ways in which you can evaluate and analyze policies. You'll talk about cost effectiveness analysis, cost benefit analysis, scenario writing, all kinds of different strategies that you can use as a public administrator to evaluate and to analyze those public policies that you have been implementing. So again, just kind of give you a little insight into what you'll be doing when you get to your 670 policy analysis course. It's 5:10, so I think it's probably a really nice time for a break right now. So let's go ahead and let's take a 10-minute break. Let's take a break until 5:20. And then we'll come back at 5:20 and we'll shift gears a little bit and we'll move from policy analysis into program evaluation. And we'll talk about how we actually engage in evaluating these specific programs that support these overarching policies and policy goals. So take 10 minutes, coming back at 5:20, and we'll get into a discussion of program evaluation. Okay, it's 5:20, so let's jump back into it and switch gears and move away from policy analysis and move to program evaluation. Program evaluation is the course you'll be taking that's called Research Methods, PPA 696. Several years ago, we talked about changing the content of PPA 696. Used to, in the past, we would teach 696 as very much classic social science research. So the first half of the class would essentially be research design. Second half of the class would be a focus on statistics. We changed that up because we didn't have enough time really in the course to talk about statistics. That's why there's now that statistics prerequisite in order to get a permit and to register in PPA 696. So we know that you will have undergraduate statistics or the 517 course done before you move into 696. So we no longer go through the specifics of statistical analysis in that 696 course. But we also realized that it was more useful for students in an MPA program to focus on program evaluation as opposed to just classic social science research methods. What we do in the 696 course is we take classic social science research methods and we place them in the service of program evaluation. So we talk about what types of skills, research skills, we typically use when we evaluate public programs. So when we're evaluating these public programs, we're evaluating these specific programs that will help us achieve our overall policy goals. So again, that bridge analogy, the policy is the bridge, and then the programs, public programs, are the stanchions that hold that bridge up. So how do we evaluate our public programs? We are evaluating our public programs primarily for the purpose of effectiveness. We want to make sure that these programs that we're spending money on are achieving the ultimate goals, that they are effective in attaining the goals that they are supposed to attain. So the purpose of this evaluation that we do is to apply empirical methods to determine the effectiveness of these public programs. Important part of that definition is obviously the term empirical. So when we're talking empirical methods, we're talking about methods that will analyze information that is tangible, information we can collect, information we can analyze and then use to render conclusions. That's what we consider to be empirical types of information. Now, empirical information can be both qualitative as well as quantitative. It can be information that we are communicating with words and phrases like we do with qualitative methods. It can be quantitative in that we are communicating that information with numbers. But both qualitative and quantitative approaches are both valid approaches in collecting and analyzing empirical type of information. So we collect this empirical information, we apply empirical methods to that information for the purpose of determining the effectiveness of these public programs. Two different approaches to program evaluation that are frequently used. One approach is what's called program impact evaluations. The other approach is a program implementation evaluation. Program impact evaluation, we're looking at the achievement of goals. And is this program having the desired impact, the desired outcome for the people who are participating in this program? Program implementation obviously looks at how the program is being implemented and the steps that we go through in implementing this program. Oftentimes we combine them together. And so our program evaluation will include both an impact as well as an implementation focus. So let's talk about some of the steps that we go through in program evaluation. Again, just to kind of give you a little flavor of some of the techniques that you'll be talking about in your 696 course. So just like with classic social science research methods, when we are evaluating a public program, we need to start with the development of an evaluation question. Just like with a research question, an evaluation question needs to be clear, it needs to be answerable, and it should have more than one possible answer. If it doesn't have more than one possible answer, if there's only one possible answer to the question, we probably already know what that answer is. And it needs to be an answerable question, something that we can answer with the collection and the analysis of empirical information. So here are a couple of examples, and they come directly from a case study that was used in 697, the research methods case study from probably about 7 or 8 years ago at this point. But here's a very simple evaluation question. Does the inmate reading intervention program decrease rates of recidivism? In this example, for this case study, we had the creation of this program, the inmate reading intervention program, whereby we had people who were meeting with inmates on a regular basis, working on their reading skills, working on their literacy skills, with the idea being that as literacy skills increase, the likelihood of recidivism, likelihood of reoffending will decrease. So does the program decrease rates of recidivism? Another way to ask the question, that's a directional question. So we're asking, does the program decrease rates of recidivism? Another way of asking the question is in a non-directional way. That would be, how does the inmate reading intervention program affect rates of recidivism? We're not asking if they decrease them or increase them. We're just asking how they affect them, how the program affects them, because that is a non-directional way of asking the question. In your undergraduate research methods courses, you probably talked about avoiding yes/no questions, yes/no research questions, because they don't really generate as robust information as you would get from a how type of question. But here in evaluation, program evaluation, we frequently do ask these yes/no types of questions, kind of as a screening question, just to figure out whether or not this program is having its desired impact. So yes/no questions are oftentimes used in program evaluation, even though they're somewhat frowned upon in classic social science research methods. So you have to define a good, clear, answerable evaluation question. Then the design of the evaluation project will obviously flow around that evaluation question. And the evaluation question will then serve as the touchstone for all of the different parts of your evaluation design. So in step 2, we then have to identify our variables and indicators of those variables, just like we would do in classic social science research. Typically, in a program evaluation, we are measuring relationships between independent and dependent variables. The dependent variable, as you know from your research courses, is the variable that is being changed. It's the variable that is being affected. This in program evaluation is usually the result of the program. So for our previous example, the result of participating in the program hopefully will be lower rates of recidivism. So lower rates of recidivism, that's the outcome, that's the dependent variable. Your primary independent variable will be some measure of the program itself. So we could ask about existence of the program. And so do recidivism rates go down after the program has been implemented? We could ask participation related type of independent variables. So we could say, does participation in the inmate reading intervention program decrease rates of recidivism? If we're measuring the independent variable by participation, then we may measure it in a binary way. Either you are a participant or you are not a participant. Participants are coded a 1, non-participants get scored as a 0. Maybe a more nuanced way of measuring participation could be the number of hours in which you participated. So how many hours did you participate in the program? So hopefully if you participate in the program 50 hours, you would have a less likelihood of reoffending as compared to someone who only participated in the program for 2 or 3 hours. But that primary independent variable is going to be some measure of that program itself. Typically, it oftentimes is a measure of program participation. Then our goal, obviously, is to isolate the relationship between participation in the program and whatever our dependent variable is, the outcome of participation in that program. In order to isolate our primary independent variable and our dependent variable, we oftentimes have to include what we call these control variables. So what other variables could independently affect the likelihood to reoffend other than participation in this reading intervention program? So we could have things such as the type of crime that was committed. Was it a violent or a non-violent crime? That could have an impact upon the likelihood to reoffend. In criminal justice, we know that the presence of drug use oftentimes leads to higher rates of recidivism. So we'll ask the question, was drug use a factor in that crime that they went to prison for to begin with? If so, then there's probably a higher likelihood that they are going to reoffend. Do they have stable employment after they leave incarceration? People who have stable employment are less likely to reoffend than those who do not. Do they have a permanent stable address, a permanent stable residence? Because that could also have an impact upon their likelihood to reoffend. So those would all be our control variables. We control those variables, we parcel them out of the equation, and then we can isolate the true relationship between participation in the reading intervention program and the likelihood to reoffend. So we have to create these variables and create measurable indicators, operational definitions of those variables. But the independent variable is usually going to be some measure of the program. The dependent variable is going to be some measure of the outcome or the goal that we're trying to achieve with that program. Typically, we will develop different models for different dependent variables. So if we have a program that's supposed to result in 3 different outcomes, we'll usually devise 3 different models, one model, one question for each one of those different outcomes. Each one of those different outcomes would then serve as a different dependent variable. We then also in step 3 have to come up with our research design that we are going to use. And when we talk about a research design, as you probably know from undergrad research, a research design speaks to how we are going to assign people either to participate in the program or to not participate in the program. So if we want to determine what the actual impact is of program participation, we need to compare those who participate in the program with people who did not participate in the program. People who participate in the program in classic social science, those are referred to as members of your experimental group. Those who did not participate in the program, those would be called members of your control group. That's in social science research. In evaluation type of research, we call experimental groups, we usually call those groups the project groups, and the control groups we usually refer to as the comparison groups. So if you see experimental group and project group, those are the same thing. If you see control group and comparison group, those 2 things are the same thing as well. Just different verbiage used for program evaluation as compared to classic social science research. So the big question we have to ask in research design is, can we randomly assign some people to participate in the program and some people to not participate in the program? One of the big advantages of being able to randomly assign people to participate or not participate is that random assignment then makes those 2 groups, your group of participants and your group of non-participants, equivalent in everything else except for their participation in the program. And that's done through random assignment, because if the assignment is purely random, then those people in the control group and the experimental group are going to be similar in everything except for participation in the program. When we use random assignment, we're using what is called an experimental design. So they have listed some examples of experimental designs for you. The only one we'll really mention is that classic experimental design. You can see the notation there. The R stands for random assignment. The O stands for an observation. So this is when we're collecting data from those individuals. The X stands for the implementation of the independent variable. So in that first line, that's your experimental group, your project group. The second line, that's your control group, your comparison group. So if they truly were randomly assigned to these groups, the only difference between those 2 groups is participation in the program. That's a very robust design because it really allows us to isolate the true impact of participating in these public programs. The problem, obviously, is that in the types of program evaluations we do in the public sector, we oftentimes do not have the ability, either legally or ethically or practically, to randomly assign people to participate or not participate, especially if this is an entitlement program. If this is an entitlement program, then everyone who is eligible is legally entitled to get benefits from participating in that program. So for those types of programs, we cannot randomly assign. The people who are in our experimental group and our control group, they self-select whether to participate in the program or not participate in the program. We cannot assign them. So oftentimes we're not able to use an experimental design, and instead we have to use what's called a quasi-experimental design. With a quasi-experimental design, we have to establish equivalency between our 2 groups, our group of participants and our group of non-participants. We cannot do it through random assignment, so instead we have to do it through statistics. So we develop our control variables and we measure our cases, our subjects on those control variables so that we can control for all those other possible differences between our groups so that we can really say the only real difference between participants and non-participants is participation in the program. Our participants participated, our non-participants did not participate. So we have to go that extra step in establishing equivalency between our groups by using statistics to develop these control variables, because we cannot use random assignment, because we cannot tell some people not to participate if they are legally eligible to participate in that program. So the more common approach we use in program evaluation is a quasi-experimental type of design. And a very common type of quasi-experimental design is a longitudinal time series analysis. We oftentimes need to measure our data in a longitudinal time series approach, especially if our variables vary over time. So if the value of our variables can change over time, we need to measure those changes over time, and we'll do a longitudinal type of time series analysis. Oftentimes what we will do in program evaluation is use an interrupted time series analysis, whereby we will look and we will measure our dependent variable before the program is implemented, and then we'll look at our dependent variable after the program is implemented. We'll look at the pattern, the trends before, the pattern and trends after. If there is a significant difference in our data trend patterns before and after, we can then assign that difference to the existence of the program itself. This is called an interrupted time series analysis. Our time series, our patterns of data are being interrupted by this program when this program is being implemented. But typically we're going to use a quasi-experimental design because we cannot randomly assign people to participate or not participate in these public programs. If they're legally entitled to the program, they must be able to participate in that program. Then we have to decide where our data are coming from in our program evaluation. Now, we oftentimes don't have the time or the resources or the ability to collect data from our entire population. So we have to construct a subset of the population, as you all know, known as a sample. How we construct that sample is just as important in evaluation as it is in classic social science research methods. So as we put our sample together, the big question is, are we randomly selecting people from the population to serve in our sample? If we are randomly selecting people, then we are using what is called a probability sampling design. We're using random sampling to randomly select people from the population to put into our sample to become the participants in our program evaluation. Now, there are different types of probability designs that all use a different approach to random sampling. The most random of probability designs is a simple random sample. Simple random sample, we have a list of everybody in our population. That's what we call our sampling frame. We can number every single case in our population, and then we'll use a random number generator. Back in the old days, we would use a random number table from the back of a statistics textbook. Now we use random number generation. You can Google online and get a random number generator, and we'll randomly generate numbers, and every number we select, we'll then put into our sample. Simple random sampling tends to create the most representative samples possible because it is purely random who gets selected to be part of this sample. Sometimes we don't have a sampling frame. Sometimes we don't have a list of all the possible people in our population. In that situation, we may want to use something like systematic sampling. So think about the example of there is a local health clinic, a public health clinic, and that local health clinic is providing services on an anonymous basis. So they don't keep track of the people who are using their services. All services are being provided on an anonymous basis. All services are being paid for by the county Department of Health. So since everything's being done on an anonymous basis, you do not have a list of people who are using that public health clinic. If you want to evaluate the services that these people are receiving by using the public health clinic, you would probably position yourself outside that public health clinic, and then you would interview every 5th or every 10th or every 20th person who walks out of that clinic. That's what's called systematic sampling. Your system is you're picking every 10th or 20th person to interview and collect data from. The problem with systematic sampling is it's obviously not purely random, in that there is not an equal non-zero chance for everyone to become part of the sample. If you're picking every 10th person, by definition, the 9th person and the 11th person will have a 0% chance of being selected to become part of that sample. So it has some randomness, but it's not as purely random as a simple random approach. but it is an approach you can use if you don't have a list of people in your population, and that would then preclude you from using a simple random type of sample. Another sampling design is what's called stratified random sampling. So if there is a variable that you think is important enough that you want to stratify or divide your sample up according to that, you can use stratified random sampling. So sometimes we'll divide our sample up according to gender. Sometimes we'll divide our sample up according to party affiliation. Sometimes we'll divide it up according to different age categories. We're stratifying our sample based upon those characteristics. Then a very common probability type of design that's used, especially by the Census Bureau, is what's called multi-stage cluster sampling. Now, we know from our coverage of the Constitution that there is a provision in the Constitution whereby we must do an enumeration of the population every 10 years for the purposes of representation in the House of Representatives. So every 10 years, the census actually has to go out there and literally count heads, literally count every single person in the country. But in between those 10 years, the Census Bureau doesn't just sit on its laurels and do nothing. The Census Bureau collects a lot of additional information about household characteristics, about labor statistics, all kinds of other information that they collect in between those 10-year enumerations. When they collected information in between those 10-year enumerations, they oftentimes use multi-stage cluster sampling. So multi-stage cluster sampling is very useful if you don't have a list of units, if you don't have a sampling frame at the unit of analysis that you want. So let's say, for example, you're doing a program evaluation that looks at the impact of a program on households. You probably do not have a list of every household in the state of California. So you can't do simple random sampling. What you can do is multi-stage cluster sampling. So you would take a random sample of counties within the state of California. So let's say you select randomly 10 counties within the state. Then from within each one of those 10 randomly selected counties, you'll then select, we'll say 5 cities from within each one of those counties. Then within each one of those 5 cities, you'll randomly select a number of neighborhoods. Then from that randomly selected cluster of neighborhoods, you'll then select a cluster, randomly select a cluster of streets. Then from that randomly selected cluster of streets, you'll then select a randomly selected cluster of households. That's how you have gotten from the state level, the aggregate level, all the way down to the household level, which is where you need to collect your data from. That's considered to be a multi-stage cluster sample. It is a good approach if you don't have a sampling frame, and it's good because at each of those clusters, each stage of those clusters you're creating, those clusters are being created through random selection. So you have randomization that's running all the way through your selection process. Probability sampling is important if we want to generalize the results from our evaluation to the entire population. So if you want to generalize the results from our program evaluation for this sample and generalize them to the entire population, we're going to need to have some type of random selection, because that ensures that our sample is representative of the population it is supposed to represent. Non-probability sampling is when you don't use random type of selection. And so common example in early stages of program evaluation could be convenience sampling. So if you're administering a program and you administer a survey to people who come in to use the services that you are providing, they're convenient to you because they're in front of you at that point in time. You give them the survey, that's a convenience type of sample. If I give everyone here tonight in this class a survey to measure what MPA students think about PPA 500, I'm doing convenience sampling. I'm giving the survey to you because you are in front of me on a Wednesday evening. Are you representative of the entire MPA population? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. So it's going to be difficult for me to say what all of you think about PPA 500 is the same as what the entire MPA population thinks about PPA 500. Another non-probability technique we can use for hard-to-reach populations is what's called the snowballing technique. Snowballing, for instance, if we are collecting information from people who lack affordable housing, then they're difficult to reach because they don't have stable addresses. So we interview one person, then we ask that person to then refer us to someone else who is also lacking affordable housing. And then it just snowballs and your sample gets bigger and bigger based upon each referral that you get. Then we have to collect our data. We can collect original data or we can collect secondary data. Original data is the data that we are collecting ourselves as evaluators and preparing our own database that we're using in our program evaluation. Secondary data is obviously we're using existing databases that other people have collected and using that for our data. When we do original data collection in program evaluation, one common tool we use is survey-based research. We construct our surveys, we send our surveys out, and we collect data through the return of those surveys. Survey research is tricky because you have to be very careful how you construct your questions on your survey, how you construct your response categories, how you sequence your questions on your survey. All of those are issues that we have to be very mindful of as we construct the most valid surveys we can possibly construct. In your 696 class, you will talk about survey construction. And whenever I teach 696, we spend a week on how we put together surveys. You get a practice at actually writing survey-based questions. It's really important because that's one of the primary tools that we use in collecting original data. If you're going to use secondary data, databases that already exist, you need to make sure those databases, that data are collected at the level of measurement that you need. After we collect our data, we then have to analyze our data, and that usually involves statistical analysis. The type of statistical analysis we use in program evaluation will depend upon the purpose of our evaluation. So sometimes in program evaluation, we have a very descriptive purpose. We want to describe the typical person who is participating in this program. So what's the typical age? What's the typical socioeconomic status? What's the typical occupation of the people who are using our programs? That's very descriptive in nature. That requires very descriptive types of statistics. That's a very simple way of analyzing our data. Often in program evaluation, we're more associational or causal in nature. Associational, we're asking, is there a relationship between participation in this program and this intended outcome? We're not necessarily saying that participating in this program is causing this outcome, but we are asking, are they associated with each other? So is participation in this job training program associated with higher levels of income among the participants? That's an associational type of question. Oftentimes in program evaluation, we are interested in causal types of evaluation questions. So what is the impact of participating in this program on this dependent variable? So how does participation in the inmate reading intervention program affect the likelihood of reoffending and recidivism? That's a causal type of question because we're asking, how does participation in the program cause a change in this outcome in this dependent variable? When we are doing causal types of evaluations, it means that we have to use much more sophisticated statistical analyses than if we were simply doing a descriptive approach to our evaluation project. We're oftentimes going to be using multiple regression, binary logistic regression, and some of those more sophisticated statistical tools in order to establish those causal links between the program and the program's intended outcome. And then obviously we take all this and we then in our final step arrive at conclusions to determine how effective the program is in achieving the goals that it is meant to try and achieve. So overall, this is what we are doing in program evaluation. And as public administrators, we need to evaluate our public programs to ensure that those programs are achieving the goals that they are intended to achieve. Because we are spending a lot of taxpayer money on these programs, and if our programs are not achieving their intended stated goals, then we have to go back and either redesign those programs or we have to replace those programs with different programs so that we are sure that we are spending public taxpayer money in the most efficient and the most effective way possible. Now, as you go into your 696 research methods class, you will talk about some of these specific techniques that you can use in conducting these program evaluations. But program evaluation is another important function that public administrators and public organizations engage in on a daily basis. And again, the primary goal for program evaluation is to determine the effectiveness of our programs. We want to be sure that our organizations are effective, that our organizations are achieving their goals. We want to be sure that our policies are effective, that our policies are achieving our overall policy goals. We want to make sure that our public programs are effective as well, that our public programs are achieving their goals. So usually when we define effectiveness, when we talk about measuring programs and policies and organizations for effectiveness, we're talking about goal achievement. And that's typically the number one way that we define effectiveness in the public sector. How well are we achieving our goals? Measuring how well we are achieving our goals is one model of measuring effectiveness known as the goal approach or the goal attainment approach. That is by far the most common way in which we measure effectiveness, but it is not the only way we measure effectiveness. I'd like to introduce you to 3 additional models for measuring effectiveness: the systems resource model, the participant satisfaction model, and the internal process model. So let's go through each one of those models of effectiveness so that we can kind of see how effectiveness is kind of a multi-dimensional, multi-tiered type of a phenomenon. That it's not just all about achieving goals, but there are other ways that we can measure effectiveness as well. But again, the goal attainment approach is the simplest approach, is the most commonly used approach, which links the stated goals of the program and effectiveness. That if we're achieving our stated goals, then we are being effective as a program or a policy or as an organization. It's a very direct linkage that we are drawing between effectiveness and the goals of the program. The problem with the goal attainment approach is that it is a very simple approach and it doesn't really consider a lot of complications. It doesn't really consider different types of goals. And so sometimes we have what we consider to be official goals, and sometimes we have what we call operative goals. Official goals are the ultimate long-term goals that we are trying to achieve. Operative goals are those intermediate goals that we achieve along the way during the process of working toward achieving our overall official goals. So sometimes we have a difficulty in identifying what are official goals versus what are operative goals. Sometimes we have multiple official and operative goals. We have goal conflict. And sometimes those goals conflict with each other. Sometimes those goals are mutually exclusive. And if so, then it's going to be difficult for us to define effectiveness through the simple achievement of those goals. So sometimes when we're not able to use a goal attainment approach, a second way we measure effectiveness in the public sector is what's called a systems resource approach. And a systems resource approach harkens back to open systems theory. You remember last week when we talked about neoclassical theories and we presented systems theory, we talked about open systems theory, the relationship between the organization and its external environment. That's a lot like systems resource approach. In the systems resource model, we measure effectiveness as the ability of the organization to secure resources from its external environment. So how well can the organization or the program pull resources in from its environment to then use those resources for organizational survival and for building and growing public policies and public programs. So effectiveness is measured by your ability to exploit resources from your external environment. One of the problems with the systems resource approach is that it's difficult to measure in that it's kind of like comparing apples and oranges. So one resource as an organization, if you look at it from an organizational perspective, one resource you can pull in from your external environment will be a well-skilled, well-qualified labor force. Another resource you can pull in could be finances. It could be appropriations. It could be grant money. That's apples and oranges. Comparing labor to money, those are two completely different things, and it's difficult to compare them to each other. Another type of resource you can pull in from the environment is political support. Political support, again, is a much different thing than appropriations, a much different thing than a skilled labor force. So it's kind of difficult when you're comparing these different resources because they are very much apples versus oranges. But what you do try and do is you take a longitudinal approach and you look at the beginning of your measurement at the types of resources you have, and then you compare it to later on in your measurement, how your resources have increased, how well you have pulled those resources in from your external environment. Systems resource approach to measuring effectiveness is a good approach to use when we're not able to use the goal attainment approach, when we don't have clear goals, when we have goals that are conflicting with each other. We're not able to measure effectiveness by the achievement of goals. So instead, we measure effectiveness by the acquisition of resources. A third model for measuring effectiveness is the participant satisfaction model. In the participant satisfaction model, we will survey our key strategic constituents, and we will see how satisfied those constituents are with the services they are receiving. So are they satisfied with what they are getting out of these public programs? Or how satisfied are they with what they're getting out of these public policies? How satisfied are they with their interactions with our public organizations? A lot of cities do this with their citizen satisfaction surveys, and so they'll send out surveys to their citizens, asking citizens if they're satisfied with the level of services they're getting, with the quality of the services the city is providing. That's a participant satisfaction type of model. Now, participant satisfaction approach to measuring effectiveness can be done externally as well as internally. If you're doing it externally, you're asking people outside the organization what they think about the organization, elected officials and citizens who come into contact with the organization. If you are doing it internally, it really kind of becomes a human resource type of an approach where you are surveying your employees, those people who are implementing those policies and programs within the organization, to see how satisfied they are working in that organization. What are their employee satisfaction levels? Do they feel like they're having their needs met? Are they getting the developmental opportunities that they feel they should be getting? So we look at both external participants to our organization as well as internal participants as well. And then your fourth model of measuring effectiveness is the internal process approach. In the internal process approach, we look internally to our organization in terms of what we are doing on a daily basis in implementing these policies and these public programs. So indicators of effectiveness in the internal process approach are things such as the strength of your organization culture, the how positive the work climate is, the feelings of teamwork and this esprit de corps, this team spirit within people who are working within the organization, within these programs and these policies. The amount of confidence and trust and communication you have between workers and management. How decision-making is done. Is decision-making done near information sources, meaning that are the people who have the information, are they the ones who are given the ability and the responsibility of making those decisions, irrespective of where they are in the overall organizational structure and chart? Is there trust that you can share facts and feelings horizontally and vertically throughout the organization? Do you have the right set of incentives and rewards for performance and growth and development of subordinates? Do you have a healthy interaction between all the different parts of the organization and all the different parts of your program structure that ensures that you are achieving the goals of the organization, the goals of the program, and that any conflict is being resolved within the interest of those organizational and those programmatic goals? It essentially looks, if you kind of boil this all down, you're looking at organizational harmony when you're looking at the internal process approach within public organizations. And the more organizational harmony you have, the more effectiveness you have as an organization. The more all the different parts of policy and program implementation work together, again, the more effective you are in implementing those policies and those programs. So sometimes we look at effectiveness. We have some really specific, discrete measures that we can look at in measuring the effectiveness of organizations, policies, and programs. And I'm not going to go through all 30 of those that are represented there on the screen for you, but some of the more important dimensions we can look at in measuring effectiveness, productivity and efficiency, the quality of the outputs that are being created by these organizations and through these public programs, things like absenteeism, turnover, job satisfaction, motivation, morale of the employees within the organization are measures of effectiveness. The flexibility and adaptation, the ability of the organization, the program to adapt to changing external environments is an indicator of effectiveness. Goal consensus, the sharing of goals between the organization and the members of that organization. Role congruence and norm congruence. Do we have congruence of values and norms and expectations in this organization culture? The skills of leaders and managers can also contribute to or detract from effectiveness. From the systems resource perspective, how well you're utilizing your environment is a measure of effectiveness. How much you value human resources is a measure of effectiveness. The amount of professional development and training that's being provided by the organization, another measure of effectiveness. So these are just some discrete measures of effectiveness, ways in which we can measure the effectiveness of our organizations and our policies and our programs in the public sector. Again, of those 4 different models, the goal model, the systems resource model, the participant satisfaction model, and the internal process model, they are not mutually exclusive. And it's possible to use combinations of all those different models in defining what you consider to be effective as an organization or as a public administrator. By far, the most common approach is the goal attainment approach, but I just want to emphasize that that's not the only way in which we measure effectiveness in the public sector. So as we are carrying out our functions as public administrators, as we are managing our organizations and leading our organizations, as we are formulating and implementing policies, as we are evaluating public programs, and then next week as we are managing our human resources and managing our fiscal resources, we are doing all these functions with an eye on effectiveness and doing them in the most effective ways possible. But again, it's important to note that there are different ways of measuring and defining effectiveness depending upon which of these models you use for your definition and your measurement. I think it's important, though, to hold on to this kind of multi-dimensional way of defining effectiveness, because as you go through your future courses in the program, you will talk about a lot of reforms and innovations that have occurred in the public sector. And all those reforms and innovations have been done for the purpose of trying to make the public sector more effective. And so it's important to know what we mean by the term effectiveness as we go about our daily functions and our daily duties as public administrators. So this information on these 4 different models of effectiveness, you will then be using, obviously, on your final assessment. And that's one of those questions that you'll be answering on your final assessment. So now that we've gone through this information, you have all the information you need to deal with the scenarios 4 and 5, the policy and program evaluation scenarios, as well as the question on how we measure effectiveness in the 4 different models of measuring effectiveness in the public sector. So you've got everything you need for those 2 scenarios. The next week, as we continue our discussion of the functions of public administration, we will then provide the information you need for scenarios 1 through 3. And we'll talk about the eras of public employment, leading into a discussion of how we then manage human resources and how we manage fiscal resources in our public organizations. So that's what I have for tonight. Are there any questions or clarifications needed or anything about these 4 different models of organizational effectiveness, or this really brief overview of policy analysis and program evaluation? Again, policy analysis is for your 670 class. Program evaluations for your 696 class. This discussion of effectiveness is something that's going to cover all of the courses that you take throughout your entire core curriculum in the MPA program. If not, then let me just remind you, you do have Canvas essay number 4 that is coming due next week. This Canvas essay number 4 should not take you much time at all to do, because I'm asking you to do the same thing that you did on scenario number 4, I believe it was scenario number 4 on your midterm assessment. You're going to be discussing public administration as an academic discipline, whether you believe it's an academic discipline and why or why not. The method behind the madness of having you do that in the discussion, as well as having you do that in the midterm assessment, is you can take your answer in the midterm assessment and you can then share it with your colleagues and get feedback from your colleagues. Because I noticed in the midterm assessment, as always does happen, and rightly so, a lot of people said, yes, it is an academic discipline. Other people said, no, it's not an academic discipline. So this is a discussion we can now take from the midterm assessment, and we can then put it into our discussion board and actually see that dialogue about whether or not it is an academic discipline. So you can literally copy and paste your answer, or distill your answer into a shorter answer, and then use that in Canvas essay number 4. Danielle, go ahead.
Hi, yes. So I had a question in regards to that discussion. So, like you just mentioned, so did you want us to, I guess, like take that information we put in our midterm assessment for that specific question and kind of paste that and then summarize it, or did you want us to write something completely different but just similar to what our ideas were in our midterm assessment?
Very good question. You can literally take your answer. It depends on how long your answer was on the midterm assessment. You can take your answer and you can just use that for Canvas essay number 4. So think about it as an opportunity to share your answer from scenario number 4 on the midterm with your classmates to get their feedback. So it's just a mechanism for feedback. So you can literally take that answer. You don't have to rewrite it. Take that answer and use it for Canvas essay number 4.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And Nancy has a good question in the text chat. Can we edit our answer from our midterm? Absolutely. If you want to change the answer you provided on the midterm and change it up then for what you're using in Canvas essay number 4, you can absolutely do that as well. It's completely up to you. Okay. So that's again Canvas essay number 4. Jules, go ahead.
I had a question going back to the, I think it's like the research designs. You said project group is the same as experimental and control is the same as what?
Comparison group.
Comparison group.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's just different verbiage that we use. So in classic research methods, we say experimental group. In evaluation design, we call it a project group. In social science research methods, we call it a control group. In program evaluation, we call it a comparison group. So just different words for the same exact thing.
Thank you.
Sure. Very good. Any other questions or clarifications or anything before we call it kind of an early night tonight, so you get out a little bit early this evening? We do have a lot of heavy lifting to do next week because we do have managing human resources and managing fiscal resources. So there is a lot that we're going to be covering next week, but I am very much committed to getting through all that next week so that you have all the information you need to then be successful on your final assessment. Then we get through everything next week, then we'll just reserve that March 15th date for you to work on your final assessment and reach out with any questions you may have as you put the finishing touches on that final assessment. Luciano, go ahead.
Hey, Professor, I have a quick question. It's not really related to the material, but it's more about taking the next classes. I noticed we got 2 more weeks and then we're done with this class, right? So my question is if I could still drop a class that I selected, or can I still add a class even though we're in the midterm of the semester? Is that possible here at Long Beach?
We have done, when I was chair, we have done that in the past, but it usually requires an exception to policy because it is so late, quote unquote, late in the traditional semester that you would have to get an exception to policy in order to add a class usually. But what you can do is you can contact Dr. Matthews and or Dr. Butts, and they can work your way through that process. And we have done it in the past. It just takes an exception to policy usually.
Oh yeah, thanks. Because like at the college, you know, right now, like the semester will be half and people could still add the class. So I was just wondering that because I think it might be too much taking this other couple more classes with my workload. So yeah, but I'll reach out to them. Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Sure. My pleasure. Danielle, go ahead.
Sorry, I just had one more question. Similar to what Luciano was talking about, it doesn't really necessarily relate to what our lecture was today, but I had contacted Dr. Matthews, I believe like a week ago, because I am starting my directed research next year. And so because I already fulfilled, well, I technically would be fulfilled in my 577 human resource management course. She said to start the study in the summer, and I didn't really know what she meant by that. Yeah, so I guess that's if you maybe can clarify what she might be talking about.
Sure. I think one of the complicating factors there would be that the new 697 cases get published in August, and so we're going to have a turnover in cases in August. So If you start the 577 case in the summer, the case is going to change in August. And because the university doesn't allow us anymore to offer 697 in the summer, the drop boxes are closed all summer long. So there's no way to actually submit the case until they reopen in the fall. So I think it probably could, and I'll defer to Dr. Matthews because she's the graduate advisor, but I would assume it probably could be possible if you work on the case and you have it done right at the beginning of fall semester, as soon as those drop boxes open, you could probably submit that case and then maybe send an email to Dr. Martin, who grades the case, and say, this is a case that I completed over the summer, and this is why it's different than the other cases that are being turned in the fall, just so he knows. And I think that probably would work out fine. But I think it would be important to communicate with Dr. Martin, let him know why the case you're turning in is the one you completed over summer, and it's different than the new cases that are being uploaded at the end of August. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so just to clarify, so you said that the case study, there's two, I guess, openings for when those case studies would be released?
All the case studies, the new case studies will be released in late August at the beginning of the new fall semester. And then the drop boxes open up the beginning of fall semester, and then they close on November 15th. Then they reopen the beginning of spring semester, and then they close on April 15th. So between April 16th and the beginning of the fall semester, the drop boxes are closed. And so there's no mechanism for submitting those cases because we're not offering 697 over the summer. And so it's kind of a workload issue that if we're not offering 697 over the summer, then there's a likelihood that there won't be anyone to grade those cases. So that's why the drop boxes are closed throughout the summer. But yes, I think if you work on that 577 case, if you got it ready to go right at the end of summer, right as soon as the case study Dropbox opens, submit it then, and then just send an email to Dr. Martin and say, this is why it looks different than the other cases that are going to be submitted later in the fall. That's happened before, and as long as the instructor knows, the instructor usually doesn't have an issue with it.
Okay, and how would we get an email in regards to the case study, or how would be notified for the prompt, or however that might be structured?
Yeah, whenever the case studies are released, and again, we're going through a change out because we're going from Beachboard into Canvas. And so by the summer, everything will be on Canvas. And so I know Dr. Butts is working through what that's going to look like of transferring everything from Beachboard to Canvas. But typically in the past, what would happen is whenever those cases are ready, Kathy Allen would then publish them onto the Beachboard organization site. And there was a site that everyone in the MPA program had access, as was enrolled in the PPA organization Beachboard site, and all the cases and instructions would then be uploaded into that site, and that's where they would be available. So I'm assuming what they're going to do is they're going to create a Canvas organization site and then post everything in that Canvas organization site. But it's usually referred to as the PPA organization site. Everyone should be enrolled in it, and if you don't see that link, currently it's probably Beachboard, but if you don't see that link at the end of summer for the Canvas PPA organization site, you may want to just search all courses, and then you may have to pin it to put it on your main homepage. But everyone who's enrolled in the MPA program should be automatically enrolled in that PPA organization site, and that's where the cases and instructions are posted.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, my pleasure. And very good questions. Excellent. Okay, any other questions or anything else before we call it an evening? Okay, if not, then I'll go ahead and make this recording available by tomorrow morning and have it up on our Canvas site by tomorrow morning. Look forward to reading your Canvas essay number 4 responses, even though I've already read them on the midterm. What I'm really looking for is the feedback from colleagues. And so my grading will be a little bit different. What I'm doing here, I'm going to just look at the feedback from your colleagues. And since I've already reviewed it, I'm probably not going to provide a lot of feedback to you on your post since I already got to provide feedback on the midterm. But it will make for a relatively quick Canvas essay number 4 for you to post. And then we'll be at it again next week on Wednesday, wrapping up our information with the management of human resources and management of fiscal resources. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a great evening, a great remainder of your week. And I'll talk to you again then next Wednesday for week number 7, if you can believe that. All right. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.